So let me welcome you to the 5th annual Professor Donald W. Meinig Undergraduate Lecture, and let me say thank you so much for coming. We began this series in 2013 as a way to do two things. First, we wanted to honor Professor Meinig's 5 decades of commitment and service to our department, and in particular to his work with undergraduates. And second, we wanted to celebrate all of the awesome accomplishments of our graduating seniors. But this event is only possible with the help of a lot of people. So let me thank the College of Arts and Sciences for helping to sponsor this. Thanks to our alumni, some of them Don's former students who support this event. Big thanks to Margie and Sarah in our office, without whom nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, would get done in our department. A big thanks to Joe Stoll, our resident map maker and photographer and program creator and anything else that we need, and to Jane Reed, who is our Director of Undergraduate Studies. And finally, thanks to our undergrads for being so awesome that we wanted to make an event to celebrate you. So let me speak a little bit about Professor Meinig. So Professor Meinig completed his PhD in geography at the University of Washington in 1953, and he came to Syracuse after a few years at the University of Utah in 1959. From 1968 to 1973, he was chair of our own geography department, which I can tell you is an impossible job. In 1973, he was named a Maxwell Professor of Geography, and in 1990 was appointed a Maxwell Research Professor. Professor Meinig has been honored with basically every award a geographer can receive. He's received both Fulbright and Guggenheim fellowships, as well as funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He won the Charles P. Daly Medal from the American Geographical Society and the Master Teacher Award from the National Council on Geographic Education in the same year. He was the first U.S.-born geographer to be elected a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and in 2010 he was awarded the very rare honor of being named a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. Professor Meinig's research is both deep and wide-ranging, but it comes together around an interest in the study of landscape, especially American landscapes, and the cultural and economic and political and social processes that shape them. He's published a number of incredibly influential works, including his classic 1979 edited collection, The Interpretation of Ordinary Landscapes. I lent my copy to a student earlier this semester, and so now I have to track it down again because I'm not sure he's giving it back. His 4-volume, The Shaping of America, that was published by Yale University Press. Now, I have to say this 4-volume set holds a very special place in my own heart because when I decided to declare a degree in geography in 1996, my supervisor, who was also a Don Meinig student, told me that I first had to read 5 books before I could declare this major. They included the 3 existing volumes of Don Meinig's Shaping of America. The 4th was in progress, Mike Davis's City of Quartz, and Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. In retrospect, it was very clear that my supervisor was just trying to keep me out of his office. But nonetheless, I read all 3 volumes of Don's work, and it was amazing because, reading his very rich prose on how the American landscape came to be, how it changed, what it meant, and why a deep study and understanding of landscape and all its complexities was important, really showed me what cultural and historical geography can be at their best. It also showed me, as it's done for many other people, why writing is such an important craft, how words matter, and how a commitment to narrative and to finding that compelling story to tell through one's empirical material is so important to geographic scholarship. So for all these reasons, and because Don is such a nice person to know, I'm very happy that after more than 20 years, when I was handed those 3 volumes to lug around in my backpack at the University of Kentucky, that I have the immense pleasure of introducing the Don Meinig Undergraduate Lecture and to getting to say thank you to Don for playing such a formative role in my own shaping as a geographer. So this year, it's also my great pleasure to introduce our Meinig speaker, Professor Rich Schein, who, as it turns out, is that same professor who handed me those 3 volumes of Don Meinig's work 2 decades ago. So Rich Schein is a professor and chair of geography at the University of Kentucky, and we're immensely excited that he's here. Rich is a properly trained historical and cultural geographer, having worked with and been shaped by two of the biggest figures in cultural and historical geography, Pierce Lewis at Penn State and our very own Don Meinig at Syracuse. And he took this grounding in historical and cultural geography, and especially in the study of landscape and the use of archival research, and really pushed it into conversation with social theory, and especially with critical studies of race. And Rich has played and continues to play a really foundational role in geography's engagement with race. He helped organize and lead a series of key conferences related to geography and race in the late 90s. It really jump-started our discipline's engagement with race, and helped give geography a way to kind of grapple with the entanglements of race and landscape, history and presence, racism and justice. His work is widely read, and it's introduced a range of key concepts to our field. So the idea of landscape as discourse materialized, the idea of racialized landscapes, those places where ideas about race take visible and tangible form, and where those forms sort of speak to a collective past, but also serve as sort of a collective signpost toward a future. He's really given us a framework, again, to sort of struggle with landscape as both what's seen and how we see, to work through very complicated histories of race and racism that are local and global all at the same time, and with the materiality and the material consequences of how we think about race. But Rich hasn't been invested sort of just in encouraging geographers to think more critically about race and space, but also in transforming the discipline in structural and institutional ways that make geography a more inviting field for a more diverse range of scholars and students. So let me close my introduction with, I think, one story that gives you a sense of Rich's impact. So my mother hates to read, she hates to sit still, and she finds most of what I do incredibly perplexing. How could anyone want to sit for hours and work on one project? Why do you want to spend all your time reading and researching? But Rich won her over from the beginning, and my mother loves Rich Schein. I worked with Rich as both an undergrad and also as a doctoral student, and my mom thinks that he walks on water. So he was always right, even and especially if I ever complained about him as a supervisor. Anytime I had an issue related to my job, my personal life, my house, my car, my mother's standard response was, well, you should just call Dr. Schein. And worst of all, he responded to all of her emails immediately when he didn't respond to mine. So she had like a direct line to him, which was very irritating. And when I first arrived at Syracuse in 2004, I of course brought my mother with me. And in my very first trip into the geography department, my mom blasted by me and marched straight into the chair's office, my brand new boss, and announced that she hoped he would be as nice as Dr. Schein, but she had her doubts. And they gave me tenure anyways. So it is my very great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Rich Schein, a Don Meinig student, my own supervisor twice over, and my mother's clear favorite. So please join me in welcoming Rich.
Is there still time for me to give a talk? All right. Who are the undergraduates here who are actually geography students? All right. Can we kick everybody else out and just have you be here? I think this may be one of the most daunting talks I've ever had to give when you're... I guess it remains to be seen whether Professor Meinig thinks I was a well-trained historical geographer or not, based on what I will present today. Jamie doesn't really have a say. We'll see what her mom says later today. So I'm probably not going to talk to notes very much, but if you see me messing around with this a little while, I do have some few quotes or a few lines that I don't want to forget that I'll remind myself of once in a while, but I'll talk to the slides. And I should point out that I feel a little bit inadequate. If you ever TA'd for Professor Meinig, the first thing you learned is that when he would come into the classroom, he would be there before you because he would be hand-sketching whatever region of the world we were talking about in chalk, in outline, on the board, at perfect scale and perfect proportions before you got to class. And somehow, stealing images from Google seems to be cheating to this very day. I use lots and lots of images. I'm a very visual person. I will not speak to all of them. They're there for you to enjoy. They are all relevant. Pierce Lewis always said, don't use an image if it's just window dressing. And these are not window dressing. They're part of the argument, but some of them are there just to make points or to support some of the things that I want to say. So I'm really, really honored to be here today. Quite simply, Don Meinig changed my life. He made me see the world in a completely new way, and I hope that comes through today in this lecture honoring him. So, if you've been looking at this, you've been wondering what these three things have in common. They're just a quick shorthand. The top one is a map of slavery. The second one is the Great Migration, is drawn by Jacob Lawrence. And the bottom one is the smoking gun of redlining discovered in a map of the St. Louis Real Estate Commission in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis. And in some ways, if you don't remember anything else today, that's the sediment that I want to make sure we remember. But what I really want to do is take you to central Kentucky, where I've come from today. We're going to Woodford County. It has, for most of the history of Kentucky, been the richest county in the state. It was just surpassed recently. It's the world's third largest producer of horses in this little tiny county. And this is the signature landscape that you would see, which seems only fitting on the eve of the Kentucky Derby this weekend, or next weekend. This is the landscape of the super rich, a place that from the 1870s on, the super rich from all over the country came to, as Thorsten Veblen would say, consume conspicuously. The signature landscape includes the four-board fences, the rock fences, the immaculately groomed lawns, the horse paddocks. It's iconic. But if I take you down the Midway Road, and you're going to see this image over and over again, we're going to be traveling up and down the axis of the Midway Road between the town of Midway and the town of Versailles, about 15 miles west of Lexington, Kentucky. And if you're paying attention to the landscape and you're looking at that signature horse farm landscape, you'll notice one farm out of place. It's the one on the left here, and it's a little bit fuzzy because it's taken from a car window at about 60 miles an hour. And you'll see that it's a barbed wire fence or a wire fence, and it's not a groomed pasture at all. It's the last remnant cattle and tobacco farm on this road. And if I had more time, I would talk to you about how this actually captures horse farm and land politics in central Kentucky. I have a second life as a planning commissioner in this county, and land politics is fraught here. It's acrimonious. It's worth millions of dollars, and in some ways, this kind of pits the cattle farmers against the horse farmers. But today, I want to bring them together and get you to think about them as part of an agricultural legacy in this part of the country that is built upon, sort of, in the cattle farm case, mixed agricultural use farms of wheat. Hemp was quite important here in the 19th century for rope, for naval and industrial uses. It's cattle country, and by the 1900s, it was also white burley tobacco country. And it was also an economy built upon slavery. And so the correlation should be pretty clear at this point between the agricultural economy and slaveholding. And you'll see that Woodford County there in the middle of the state was, on the eve of the Civil War, a majority slave county. It looked more like South Carolina than it did like Kentucky, most of Kentucky or Tennessee. In fact, there were so many slaves in central Kentucky that as early as the 1840s, there was a surplus. They were gathered in nearby Lexington, 10 or 14 miles to the east, where they were sold at the Cheapside auction block, shipped down the river, Ohio and Mississippi rivers, to the westward migrating cotton belt. After the Civil War, many, if not most of those people of color eventually moved out of the region. They joined the Great Migration north and west, but not all. Many moved first into the cities, and on the right-hand side, you've got a map of African-American enclaves in nearby Lexington. I think you made that, didn't you? Yeah. Which is why it's here. They moved into into enclaves in Lexington, which still persist to some extent to this day. I won't talk about those today. But then there was suddenly a labor shortage. A slave economy without slaves needs people to work. And so a lot of the horse farmers of all stripes enticed people of color to come back from the cities to live in the countryside. And there then emerged, excuse me, by the 1880s at least, a whole series of what became known at the time as Negro hamlets or black hamlets, shown in red on this map of 3 or 4 or 5 counties all around Lexington, including Woodford County. And the standard kind of form that those settlements took is shown in this middle slide made by my colleague Carl Rates, which shows you beef and cattle pasture, horse pasture, clover, hay, corn, burley tobacco, horses, owners' residence, breeding paddocks, and breeding barns and stallion paddocks, and the black hamlet, the labor living in these places. So we're starting to get a kind of a picture of an agricultural economy, a slave economy, a post-slave economy, captured in those kind of horse farm and tobacco cattle farm landscape. And it shows up in the, let's just call it the culture of the region for now. This is a poem from my colleague and friend Frank Walker, who's the founder of the Appalachian Poetry Movement. He's the poet laureate of Kentucky at the moment, and you can read this as well as I can. He talks about, this is about the famed jockey Isaac Murphy, who still holds the record for the Kentucky Derby wins at a time when blacks were the jockeys before Jim Crow removed them from that position in the early 20th century. And young boys with the right attitude could work at hotels as porters, messengers, and janitors, but if you were lucky, you got to go work with the horses. And this is borne out in the pictorial record. These from the turn of the 20th century, from some of those black hamlets. The picture in the upper left is the most famous of all grooms, Will Harbut, holding perhaps the most famous of all horses, Man o' War. On the right-hand side, you've got somebody working a cane brake. This is how you turned hemp into fibers for rope. You've got a man chopping tobacco down in the lower right-hand corner, and in the lower left-hand corner is a couple outside their home in Maddoxtown just carrying on everyday life. These are from a collection of one of those pictures of one of those African-American hamlets early on. And all of this is in some ways unremarkable. It's simply part of that Euro-American imperial frontier that violently wrested the land from the Native Americans. On the right-hand side, we've got central Kentucky settled by the 1790s, displacing natives, and I send you to volume 1 of Shaping of America to get wonderful depictions of how this process worked. And so central Kentucky becomes one of those places that are part of the congeries of places, that ever-changing system of places, that big picture kind of historical geography that Don Meinig gave us, and I want to drop this place that I'm going to talk about into that framework. So I promise you there are only 4 slides like this in the whole talk. Well, there are a couple of quotes from somebody from oral history later. They don't count. These are the only 4 kind of academic slides for a talk at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. And now you've had time to read this, and I think I always took inspiration. You know, many, many years ago, Don Meinig was pointing out that we were in trouble in some ways here. And that what we really need to do is pay attention to the longue durée, as the historians taught us to say. And I always took heart. I certainly love those big picture kind of geographies, but I'm not really a big picture person. I'm a small picture person in the everyday. And so I like this statement where the big picture really emerges from a scale of landscape and locality, that which most enlivens a sense of ethics and aesthetics. And the aesthetics I probably won't talk much about today, although I firmly believe that the landscapes we're looking at are beautiful and aesthetics can mean more than that. I do think that aesthetics, it also includes ethics. I think these are words that are insuperable, and the ethics part is what motivates me in many ways here. And so I've written a lot about cultural landscape, racial formation, justice. I increasingly think of landscape methodologically as a way for us to interrogate social wrongs in the world. Think Confederate statuary in Courthouse Square and the ways in which different discourses are materialized in that space, and they provide a mediating moment for us to talk about the wrong that that might encompass. But I came here to Syracuse 30-some years ago because I felt the landscape I was learning was missing something, and it was that longue durée, that historical basis, that kind of deep and intimate familiarity with land and locality. And for me, historical geography is about the past, but it's also about the claims that we are making for now and the future that are based on the past. Historical geography for me becomes a place to intervene into discourses and assemblages of race and racism. That's mostly my theory for today. Now, I'll admit, I'm a little bit nervous, and I was talking to some students in a couple of instances today. I'm a little nervous these days. I spend a lot of my time basically talking to white people about white hegemony and white supremacy. That's kind of what I do. And this place is, I do that in Kentucky a lot too, and Kentucky is a very different kind of place. When I talk about race today, I know that I am stuck in a black-white racial binary. That's what I'm talking about because that's the deep sedimentation that I'm most interested in. I'm fully aware that race means all kinds of things and includes other kinds of people, and we can have a conversation later about that if you like. I'm also a little concerned because I think we're at a very, I don't even know the adjective to use. Interesting is too banal, and traumatic is too hyperbolic, perhaps. But I think we're at a time in American politics and American history where we're having to come to some reckonings. And so I've just put a few images up here to point out that, yes, we're talking about Trayvon, and yes, we're marching against violence, but we also had the civil rights movement. This is the Birmingham Memorial in Kelly Ingram Park to remember what Bull Connor did in the 1960s to children in Atlanta. And, the one on the right goes back to Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Stono Rebellion. It seems to me that there are conversations we've been having for a long time that are emerging again, and I'm not sure that some of the things that you need to hear me, somebody who looks like me, somebody with my background, I'm not sure you need to hear me. So like any good academic, that's not going to stop me. I cast around, I cherry-picked, I looked for something that would give me the right to speak, and I found it in Angela Davis's new book, which I recommend if you haven't read it. And I take heart that she reminds us about the category human as not being universal, but she calls for that public conversation. And in the end, she also reminds us that we need to look for those cultural and structural elements of slavery that are still with us, and that's part of what I do. So today, though, I want you to think small. Nobody ever tells you that anymore. I want you to think small. We're never going to leave the Midway Road for the next little while. No, I have no overarching conclusions. This isn't a typical talk with a thesis and an empirical content and some kind of now your world has been changed. But there are theories in there, I promise. Ideas about bringing the margins to representation, about landscape as a social wrong, about the importance of belonging as an intervention, the importance of historical geography. And what I'm going to do then for the rest of my time, and I forgot to notice what time I started. Have I been going for about 10 minutes now? Does that sound about right? 15, 10? So basically, depending on how long it takes me to tell these stories, I just want to tell you 3 stories. 2 for sure, maybe 3. We'll see how much time I have and if I think you're nodding off or not. So I'll dive in. 3 stories. This is a picture I use all the time. Maybe you've seen it before. It's my house. So I like to start where I live. It's my house built in the 1840s. This is a Sanborn fire insurance map. When I first found this map, I was intrigued because up here it tells us that there are 75 feet away, there are Negro dwellings in the parlance of 1903. This is the classic southern land pattern where there's a big house up on the main street and small clusters of African Americans living behind you. And I thought about that in a sense of, we need to, in a Stuart Hall kind of way, we need to bring the margins to representation, let these people come to the map. And then I had one of those Homer Simpson moments, and I said, wait a minute, there are black people on this map already. My house was built by slaves. There were slave quarters there originally. And so I had a kind of inspired by Toni Morrison and her Africanist presence. This to me is a cartographic manifestation of that. There are people of color in labor, at least, in this place. And that's the normalizing work that landscape does. It makes us forget that kind of stuff. So I want you to walk out my front door, and we're going to turn left on Cross Street. We're going to go 3 blocks up to the Poor Cemetery. And I live in a village of 1,800 people. We all know each other. It's a tiny little place outside Lexington in the middle of that countryside. And we're at the Sons and Daughters of Relief Cemetery. And that grave is right about there. And I know you can't read it. It's really hard to photograph an old grave. And that's the grave of Richard James. And it tells you that he was born in 1881 and he died in 1921. And I hesitate. It's taken me a long time to use this example in a public talk. But I think the time is probably right, and I hope that I can do this and honor Richard James. But Richard James was lynched. He was lynched in 1921, just down the road, on the Midway Road, the road that we're going to be on all day. And the story, as best as I can piece it together, because you can never really piece these things together, and this is one of the kind of sub-themes of the talk, is how do you get at the stories of people who aren't in the records, right? The archives don't tell you stuff. But the story, as best I can piece it together, is that this is bourbon producing country, There was in Midway in the 1920s a distillery. It was still in operation even through Prohibition, through a special license. And it turns out, I think, there was a crooked white foreman who had a deal with 3 black guys in town, and he would periodically leave the door unlocked. And they would sneak in the evenings, and they would steal some whiskey, and then they would take it off and sell it, and they would bring back the proceeds, and the 4 guys would split it. And it looks like one night the foreman forgot to unlock the door. So the 3 guys broke into the distillery because they were supposed to steal the whiskey that night. And when they broke into the whiskey, the station manager at the train station next door heard them, and he came running with some other people. And a scuffle ensued, and this is where it gets complicated and the stories don't match, and who knows what happened. But in the end, 2 white guys were shot, and they both died. Of the 3 black men involved, 2 left town, disappeared. 1 was caught and taken into the next county over in Lexington and put in jail for a while. Eventually, he was brought back and put in the county seat in Versailles, at the other end of the Midway Road, where a trial was held. He was found guilty. No surprise there. The surprise was, though, that the jury was deadlocked. Well, it was a hung jury. 11 men on the jury voted to hang Richard James. 1 abstained on the grounds of religion. So they took Richard James back to the jailhouse. A mob, according to the New York Times, who covered this thing in 1921, a mob of something like 50 men came into Versailles from Midway, told the jailer to get lost, took Richard James out, and hanged him in a tree at the end of the Midway Road. That tree is gone. This is not that tree, but this is the landscape. This is where that tree was. So I learned some of this story from the archives. I learned some of this story from newspapers, and I learned some of this story from Helen Garner. Helen Garner is a neighbor of mine. Helen passed away this year at about 80 years old, and she was part of an oral history project that was done in the early 1990s by Christina Minister, an oral history project that I picked up with my friend Helen Wrench again about 3 or 4 years ago that we're continuing to do in Midway. So the next slides are from Helen, both from the conversation in 1991 from the records and from when we talked to her in December a couple of years ago. She points out that her grandmother was a James and that Richard was her uncle. And you can read this and see her story about this. But it corroborates some of what I'm saying. It's an oral history. It's a tale of what happened in this town. She points out that the other men involved, that they say did it, they actually ran away and never came back. They took Richard out of the jail and they hung him. And the thing that I think strikes me the most is the last line where they used to point out this big, huge oak tree. I guess it was a big oak tree. This is where your Uncle Richard was hung, on this tree. And the thing that strikes me most about this is the kind of oral history tradition, the thought of kids going to school on the school bus every day, driving past this site, being told by their family to remember this site, to remember this is where Richard James was hung, and having that be a part of your everyday experience. But there's more to the story than just that lynching itself, even in Helen's telling, which was about her uncle. All these men went to Midway, they got him, they lynched him, it was a big uprising, and the black men in town got their guns and waited for the repercussions. They waited for the mob to come back to town. And they laid low, and the mob came back to town, and nothing happened, and apparently it all blew over after a few days. But the story then follows to tell about how all the men that were into lynching met an evil end. They all got their just desserts, in a sense. This is the story that Helen told. And she goes through them, one by one. One got burned up in a car, and one went kind of crazy, and one fell out of a tree. And I like the fact that, when she's asked who told you these stories, it's kind of like, well, everybody. These are the stories. These are the things that we grew up with, the ways in which we understand Midway. Okay, let me turn to a note here for a second. So I had that in mind. I knew that story. And then about 8 months ago, I got some new neighbors in the small townhouses behind my house, replacing some of those old houses that were on that map. And I recognized them. I recognized them as 2 women who used to live about 2 blocks down the street, actually right next to Helen Garner's house, because it's a small town, and whenever I would drive by there, we'd wave to each other, and sometimes we'd say hello, but I didn't know them well. But I was out cutting the grass, and so I went over and we started chatting. And we just talked about a lot of things. And then they said, they introduced themselves. It's Wanda and Geraldine. And then I said, well, what's your last name, Wanda? And she told me her last name, and her last name is the name of one of the two men who left town. And so I said, look, you're going to think I'm crazy. And so we started talking about the lynching, and she told me about the lynching, and she told me about how central that lynching was to her family story. Not because of the social wrong, not because of the lynching, not so much because of Richard James, although obviously this was a horrible thing and they knew about it, but because of how it shaped, in fact, how her family trajectory took place. Her grandfather and another man had to leave town, never came back. The family changed their name. And so I suddenly started thinking about the ways in which the kind of landscape of a social wrong, pitting it all on the lynching, was not quite enough. There's an ensemble here that includes, this is the distillery, the remnant distillery that's still there. The distillery, the graveyard, the lynching, their stories, the oral histories. And that the landscape itself is more than just the stories of resistance or even resilience in the face of white supremacy. There's another landscape that doesn't get to live in books, that's told in, or even newspaper articles, that's told in stories, and it's told by family stories that are passed down from generation to generation. And we share the same landscape, but the meanings aren't necessarily the same, even though they overlap. Now, at this point, I have to pause quickly because I had a kind of a methodological crisis moment. The only other place I really told this story was a talk I gave at Wisconsin a few months ago. And I decided finally that I wanted to tell this story. But I thought, how can I tell this story? You know, Helen knows that I would tell the story. And I had to go ask Wanda and Geraldine. And I was absolutely terrified that they were going to say, don't tell this story, and then I'm done. But I geared up the courage one night, and I went over and I said, you guys, I'm a professor, right? And they said, oh yeah, we know what you do. I said, I would really like to tell this story. And they would prefer that I don't tell the story very often in Midway, because families of all parties involved still are there. But they said, no, you're going to Wisconsin, you tell that story. You tell that story to those students, and you tell me what their faces looked like when you told me that story. So in a way, I've been mandated by Wanda and Geraldine to share these stories about land and life, about their family, about the things that they have experienced. And I think this is a moment, I was going to do it earlier, I couldn't figure out where to do it. This is where, I said how much Don Meinig meant to me, and I also need to point out that, it didn't occur to me till a few years ago that most of what we did here as geographers and I did was at a distance. But I did learn something else while I was at Syracuse, and I learned it from John Western, who told us about talking to people and how important it was to talk to people. And if you haven't talked to John ever about his stories of going to people's houses and having dinner and talking to them, and then going and scribbling notes under a streetlight on a London street, so you don't forget it all before you get home, although I know John, he's probably told them to you anyway, so. All right. So, in a way, to get at these stories, I had to leave the archive behind, right? The traditional bailiwick of the historical geographer. And what this has led to is doing an oral history project. I do it with my friend Helen Wrench, who's white. I do it with my friend Helen Garner, who's now died, who is black. We don't know what to do except to call White Helen and Black Helen and me do this project. And it's not my project anymore. It started out because I happened to walk into a community dinner one night and sat with a table of, this was 20 years ago, I thought they were elderly ladies then, they're my age now. And they started talking about livelihoods. They started talking about hunting and food and talking about recipes in central Kentucky. And they were black women whose families had been there for 3 or 4 generations. And they told these amazing stories about access to that rich horse farm landscape that neither you nor I could have access to because, well, maybe you're rich, I'm not. I can't get onto those farms. And I suddenly realized they have this access because their families have been working those farms for generations. And it gave me a whole new insight in how to start to get at some of these tales of land and life. And so we started this little project, but once the word got out that I was doing this, I would stop in the corner grocery and somebody would say, I heard you interviewed Josephine Carr last week. How come you didn't interview me? Or how come you didn't talk to my great auntie who's older than Josephine? No, I never got that. How come you didn't talk? Because my stock answer was, Josephine's older, she's going to die sooner. And that seems to work. That seems to work. So what you see here is one of my PhD students, Artina Hamilton, who helped me one year at the Huntertown Community Reunion, and we started talking to people and taking these oral histories. And suddenly it's become a participatory action project in the community. One day I got a call and they said, you know, 6 women who went to King's March on Frankfurt in 1963 are going to be back in town for church and they want to talk. And so they came over to my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, and I keep a tape recorder handy. And it's not about livelihoods, it's not about property, it's not about stuff I want to talk about, but they also know that they're going to talk to me, and these stories are going to go on tape, and they're going to go into the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky and get valorized, and they like that. So we're carrying on some of these projects. Okay, story number 2. How am I doing? Am I going to get to 3? I know you're just waiting to see if I get to 3. Story number 2. We're still on the Midway Road. This is that farm. This is the farm of the tobacco and cattle farm of the wire fence. And here's a Google aerial, whoops, oh, don't look ahead. Here's a Google aerial view. So if you drive in from that wire fence, you see a big house, a whole bunch of outbuildings, a white burley tobacco barn. And that's the big house complex. It's an amazing place, actually. It's surrounded by a sinkhole. There's a cave down here, which I'm sure is full of Indian artifacts. And in fact, there's one farm near here. You know, I can take you, and we could see actually an 800 to 1,000-year-old Hopewell mound next to a Euro-American cemetery, next to a slave cemetery, which starts to talk about the things that are going on here. But for now, we'll look at, this is the 1798 cabin, which has been clad. This is the 1830 house, which looks small, but has 18 by 18 rooms. And this is the giant, we're guessing, 1870 kind of Victorian monstrosity that was put on the front. And the reason I got interested in this is because a friend of mine, or a couple friends of mine, who are kind of historic preservationists, they go into some of these farms and they restore these big old houses. But if they can't restore them, they save the materials. And my friend Phil, who's shown down here with my other friend Walker, are taking down a stone bank barn. The owner of this farm wanted to get rid of these buildings. And so he called Phil and said, Phil, you want to buy these materials? And Phil's taking the materials and is building something else. And while they're tearing down this building, which is probably an 1830s double-pen southern cabin, a slave quarters, while they're tearing down this building, they find this under the dirty plaster in the building. This little picture, and if you can't make it out, it looks like a drawing of a female in a dress with a pattern, and here's her head and a chin. Here's a moon, shining moonlight on the person, and she's standing on what looks like just a flat thing, but when we scraped away the dirt in front of the cabin, there was a herringbone brick patio in front of the cabin. So we found this picture, and we're thinking, what is this thing? Is it a slave drawing? Is it not a slave drawing? And I called on, I have a joint appointment in historic preservation. I walked over there, nobody had a clue. I used some contacts. I called somebody at Colonial Williamsburg who put me in touch with somebody who does historic American graffiti at the University of Delaware. I made a call to the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati. We have a call into the new Smithsonian Museum. And Phil, who knows about building materials, in taking down this cabin, said, you know, the original cabin's 1830, but when I get up in the rafters, it's been modified and judged on the materials and the construction. I think about 1870, 1865, 70. And the Williamsburg people say, you know, the plaster and the nails look like they're about 1870 or so. And the guy at Delaware says, you know, Civil War era graffiti is a dime a dozen unless you can associate it with people of color, and then it's extremely rare. We almost never find it unless we see it in churches. And so I'm thinking, well, I want to try to date this thing. And more importantly, I'd like to know who this is. And I'd like to know who drew it. And I'd like to know who lived here as one of those stories of the place. Well, of course, I'm not going to get any stories about the person who drew it, but I can draw upon my skills as an historical geographer and go into the courthouse in Lexington and start tracing deeds. Anybody ever hear trace deeds? It's great, the first 2 deeds, it works really, really well, and then you realize they subdivided the property, or they all bought another one, or somebody died and left it to their aunt. And anyway, I think I got it down. And what you're going to figure out in this story is there are about 36 leaps of faith along the way. But that's all we have in telling stories about people who have no record. So I went and I traced the deeds back from Mr. Cleveland, who owns it now, and I get back to the time period I want to be in, sort of just before the Civil War, just after the Civil War, thinking about that 1870 date. We also know, probably from the construction, that that big house in the front, the big red brick one, was probably built about 1870 or so. It's the right style. And our thesis is basically that they brought in plasters to build that house. And if they were bringing in plasters to build that house, they might have done this quarters as well at the same time. So I trace back the deeds, and I get back to F.P. Kincaid in around the period just before and just after the Civil War. Meanwhile, about the same time, I attended an auction at another big house on the Midway Road, and I bought two books at that auction, and one was an 1877 original atlas that included Woodford County. And in there, there's Midway, Versailles is down here, there's the Midway Road, and there's T.H. Swope's house, exactly where I think the house that we're standing on is, and I find out T.H. Swope was one of the owners, so I know I'm narrowing in on the right place. The house I bought this place from was pretty amazing, by the way. I bought it in a room where behind me was hanging a big poster supporting the Confederacy. The second book I bought was a history of Woodford County, but it wasn't a history like you or I might think of a history book. It was just a story of every white family that had ever lived in the county from 1780 to 1930, and it pretty much led up to the author being at the top of the heap. This is a really interesting book, though, because this is a place where, like, land and property reign supreme. Right? And you think about the importance of land and property to the franchise, to the vote, to citizenship in American society. And in a sense, this is a kind of a claim to white patriarchy through landed aristocracy in central Kentucky. And I found the Kincaids. Well, I found when they first came to America, and I found when they came to Kentucky, and I found from Virginia, and I found the grandfather, and finally I found Francis Kincaid, and I learned about him, and so these things are all corroborating to tell me that this was Francis Kincaid's house in 1860 and in 1870. So then I went to the manuscript census schedules, and I find that Francis Kincaid, on his cattle, hemp, tobacco farm, did in fact own 35 slaves. Unnamed, but he owned 35 slaves. And then I find that in 1860, on the same farm, there were 3 people, Francis, his wife Mary, some old guy about 79, maybe it's Mary's dad, maybe it's the old foreman who stayed on the plantation, and there were 7 people of color, several children, and this time they have names. And so, you know, I wanted to know, were these the people who might have been there before? But how do I know? They don't have names, but I can at least find out, okay, this is a woman whose age, whose age is, and I can go back and find somebody who matches that 10 years earlier who was 10 years younger, right? You follow this. And then I kind of like drew a sharp breath because the woman who is 49, maybe the oldest woman, maybe the one depicted in that image, maybe sometime later, is called Susan James. That James name just keeps cropping up. And then I was just, so I'll admit it, I'm just walking out of the shower one day at home, and I pass this portrait that my wife has hanging in her upstairs hallway. My wife is English. She comes from a family that has Scottish connections. This is some dour old great-grandmother of hers that scares me every morning when I get out of bed. But this painting has provenance. We've seen paintings by the same artist in the national museums in Scotland. And I'm thinking, these things aren't so different in some ways, or at least I'd like to think they're not so different. They're respecting your ancestors, they're a history, they're drawing attention, but this one doesn't have a name, and this one, well, I guess she does. So let me make a segue here. So it strikes me when I look at the people in the second story, the people of color from the farm, that they appear in many ways to be standing outside modernity. The Woodford County landscape of freehold property tenure is modernity. It's a Foucauldian one, if you like that kind of theory of self-disciplined subjects. But I've always thought about lynching as a kind of a counter to Foucault's notions of discipline and punish. Because while we're supposed to be disciplined during the transition to modernity, lynching is very clearly a punishment, and it's a punishment that marks a spot. And that has always troubled me in ways that I'm trying to also work through in this particular story. And so I keep thinking about the people who once were property, now standing in this landscape somewhat differently. About the oak tree that Helen Garner and her contemporaries drove by every day, that everybody told them about. That was not a discipline. It was a punishment for people to tell about until they did. I have time for story number 3. What's that?
I said you came all this way.
Story number 3. This is a contemporary story. So I don't know if Syracuse has been through this, but surely you've been aware that institutions of higher education all across the country are struggling with the legacy of slavery, of colonialism, of racism in their built environments. And halls are being renamed and students are protesting, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a wonderful thing because everybody's paying attention to the landscape and what is sedimented in it. So we have our own little version of this at the University of Kentucky, and it involves a mural. A mural painted on it's fresco. So, you know, I'm no art historian. All I know is that's kind of stuff that looks kind of like stucco-y plaster, and you can't remove it very easily. And about a year and a half ago, our president, after meeting with some students, representatives of the Black Student Union on campus, covered the mural up, put a big shroud over it. Now, the location of the mural, I would argue, is quite important. You can see it's in a building that has a big auditorium. This is a really important auditorium. Law school graduation is in here. Big lecture classes are in here. It's in Memorial Hall. This is the building itself. And it's just not any old building on campus. It's an iconic building. It's a building that is in the letterhead for my department between the U and K of UK. It's a building that is inscribed in cut steel in the UK of the medical center's walking bridge across one of the main streets. Right? So it's a place of pride. And here is the mural itself in that hallway going to those same doors, by those same doors you saw in the last slide. So, you know, okay, we're not in the Midway Road anymore, but in some ways I'd suggest we are still on the Midway Road. What is it that the students objected to in this mural that made it be covered up? And if you look carefully, it was a mural, it's an absolutely gorgeous mural. I've been using it in classes for years and sending students over to look at it and talk about what it has in it. It's ostensibly a story of Kentucky, although it's really mostly about central Kentucky, about Lexington, from the pioneer days to the modern era. It was commissioned by the Works Progress Administration, as so many murals were across the country in the 1930s during the Depression. And the ostensibly offending bits of the mural include this scene right here for people of color bending over, planting. They're not picking, that's planting small tobacco, the tobacco in the spring, with the railroad symbolically running across their back. Here we've got a few African Americans singing and picking and grinning for white people dancing. I think there's one more. I think there's a young boy in a tree somewhere. Does anybody see it? I can't remember where it is. It's a depiction of the Chautauqua that used to come through Lexington, and there's a boy listening in the tree. It's also got Native Americans depicted with tomahawks about to take over the fair maiden getting water at the stream. Did you find the boy in the tree somewhere? I saw you point. And so the mural was covered. And you can imagine some of the responses that came for this. Maybe you're having some of the same responses. Why cover the mural? This is censorship. Well, why is that so horrible? In fact, that is exactly what happened. Black people did plant tobacco. And symbolically, we might claim that the economy of the region was built upon their backs. You can imagine the kind of online response that this got from certain kind of religious and more right-wing organizations, for instance, decrying the political correctness, which is now used as an epithet, apparently. I thought it just meant treating everybody equally. Decrying the political correctness of this because, and you know, so they're minimized, because 24 black students have taken objection to this. This is not a right thing to do. But then I was a little bit surprised when one of my kind of sometimes heroes weighed in on the matter. Wendell Berry, some of you may remember from the Small is Beautiful movement and agricultural, he's always supported the small farmer and small agriculture. He's become sort of a symbol of the Back to the Land movement, amongst other things, of organic agriculturalists now look to Wendell Berry, although ironically he grew up on a tobacco farm and his father was a tobacco farmer. And he's my one-time colleague at the University of Kentucky, who basically took great exception to the covering of the mural, really sort of on grounds of censorship and free speech. He pointed out, in fact, that this is only showing people what they do. And then his ultimate defense was to point out that he knew the woman who drew the mural. It was, in fact, his wife's aunt. And he knew her well. She was liberal for the times. She certainly could not have been racist. And in a way, in my mind, he deflects then the work that the mural does and deflects it onto the intention of the author. And we can argue that work that art does and the intention of the author are perhaps separable things. In fact, he never uttered one racist word. Somewhere in here, he also points out that, in fact, the black janitor who worked in the evenings while she was there didn't object. He brought her Coca-Colas every evening. So in response to that, another editorial was submitted to the newspaper, claiming something else, that it really wasn't about Anne Rice O'Hanlon who drew the mural. It wasn't about her intention. It was about those 18 students who went and talked to the president. It was about listening to students and why they said that the mural bothered them. It turns out that the students came to the president with 18 demands for equity and justice issues on campus. And the mural was number 18. It was low-hanging fruit. You could fix that immediately in ways that you couldn't, say, hire 20 new faculty in the law school. And so I'm glad the president did this. He formed, of course, a committee who looked into this, covered the mural. But this editorial said, look, the point is the students were listened to. They had claims. Perhaps, I don't want to show you a picture of Rashad yet. Perhaps they are wrong. Perhaps they don't know how to read that tobacco picking. But in some ways, if they're not quite sure how to interpret it, that's not their fault. That's our fault. I'm the professor. I'm supposed to talk about those things in my classes, but they don't get talked about in classes in ways that students might understand a different perspective on this. And in the end, it reminded me of, I don't know if you guys know Marlon James. It just occurred to me that his name is James, too. Marlon James, a Man Booker Prize winner, who blasted the blogosphere about a year ago about issues like this. Remember, sort of after Ferguson and then university things started happening, people started saying, oh, these whiny students. These whiny students, again, every single little thing seems to offend them. And Marlon James kind of went ballistic on this and pointed out, he called this the liberal limit, that these students had everybody's support until sort of sacred cows of perhaps Wendell Berry's aunt were attacked. And then suddenly we've reached the liberal limit and the students are whiny instead of doing things that are interesting. And maybe we should listen to the students. And so I wrote this editorial, by the way. And so to the students. This is Rashad Bigham. I actually ended up on that committee that the president appointed, and I sat next to Rashad most of the time. And Rashad was great. He pointed out that, in fact, it wasn't so much that they objected to the truth in the mural, is that if you walk around the campus at the University of Kentucky, which was segregated within, has been segregated within living memory, that is probably the only depiction of people of color on campus. And it wasn't they objected to that. They said, where are the positive moments? Where are the people that we can look up to? Where are the role models? Where are the people that have done good things on campus? And there are some. And so what they wanted to do was basically call attention to the fact that there needed to be a shift in the ways in which we thought about the campus and thought about the things that we were doing. And in the end, we agreed. We met with the students. We agreed. And actually, the students met themselves. It became a catalyst for a larger conversation around a whole bunch of things, a town hall, an overflow crowd that the president didn't show up at, big mistake, with all kinds of issues being discussed in campus, and I would say in pretty good ways. And in the end, we uncovered the mural. Do I have that one? Yeah, we uncovered the mural and got a commitment from the president to commission an artist of color to fill the hallway of Memorial Hall with some piece that is in conversation with that particular piece. And everybody seemed to be happy about this. So it wasn't so much that we had to correct those students and say, this is the way you need to look at that. It was more like we needed to listen to them and figure out what the issue was and have a dialogue that took place, I would argue, through this landscape. That landscape of tobacco farmers is a real one. I'm reminded of Don Meinig's article about symbolic landscapes and how they emerge from very real places to come to stand for other things. This is one of those. And it came from the Midway Road, from those very farms that we've been looking at. So that's mostly what I want to talk about. I wrote down a couple of concluding sentences, so this iPad doesn't like me today. So if you gave me more time, or if you came and took a class with me, I would tell you these kinds of stories all semester. I have lots of them. These are other ones, like there's the instance of where the local museum didn't want to display the shackles because they were afraid people might be upset if they saw them. There's the cemetery, the former slave cemetery, that we facilitated some archaeologists to come in with LiDAR to try to locate the graves and try to figure out where they were and to mark them and just sort of bring the margins to representation, get a sense of belonging. As a planning commissioner, I've been part of a group that's taken over one of those old African-American hamlets, those black hamlets. It was given to the city in a land deal, and when I went and walked through it, I realized this is Huntertown. We were in conversation, we need money, you always need money, but we're in conversation with landscape architects for how we might build picnic shelters. It might be on the sites of the old houses. It's hardly going to change the world. It's not a radical solution, but at least speaks to the place of people who once lived here, who are here no longer. We've been part of conversations. This is our state capitol in Jefferson Davis, and we have the Confederate Monuments in the courthouse square, and we're part of conversations about what to do with those. There are lots of stories like this. So just let me read my concluding paragraph, and I would say, the American landscape is racialized, always. It's one mechanism that holds our lives together or keeps them apart. We can interrogate the landscape for its place in our lives, and especially for its elucidation of social wrongs. Through a particular landscape epistemology and methodology, we have tools to understand racialized landscapes as social wrongs, looking at their historical geographies, the importance of naming to meaning and identity and belonging, through their ability to help us mediate social conflict, to help us intervene in racist discursive formations, all in the name of justice. How to do this is the hard part, especially in the listening and suspending disbelief, being prepared to go beyond what Marlon James calls the liberal limit, looking for transformative rather than affirmative strategies of social resistance. I'm intrigued by the moments where this happens, in oral histories maybe by following somebody like Karen Till's work on a place-based ethics of care. There are other ways. I'm impressed by the resilience of my neighbors and proud of the accomplishments of some of my colleagues who work in other realms, such as the arts and literature, to bring other points of view to our attention. And we have learned from Catherine McKittrick, for instance, of the epistemic violence done when we only look at the experience of people of color in terms of the wrong done to them by white people, even as we need to remind ourselves continually that our racialized landscapes are fraught with white supremacy and white hegemony. But we also need to listen and learn about other ways of doing. Thank you.
Now I have the mic, so ask away.
I have one too.
You can't move from your podium.
Yes. Oh.
That's a great talk, Rich. You lived in Syracuse for what, 3, 4, 5 years?
If you say so. It was really longer than that, but I don't. Okay. I don't like to admit how long it took me to write that dissertation.
What stands out in your recollections as being an example of some kind of a racialized aspect of the Syracuse landscape?
So that's a really good question, and you guys should answer it for me because we talked about that this afternoon. So, no, you guys asked me, like, when did I really start thinking about race? And I kind of grew up thinking about race for various reasons. My father grew up in East St. Louis in the 1920s and 30s. But it wasn't on my mind when I was here. It just wasn't. I was trying to figure out, for me, I was trying to figure out how to make landscape have depth. And I suppose, the thing that probably I remember the most is the Jerry Rescue. Right? The idea that this place was perhaps a stop on the Underground Railroad and that there were sort of sympathizers and that sort of thing here. But I don't really, I didn't think about that stuff as much as I should have. I thought about ethnicity, because a lot of students at the time were writing about the sort of landscape palimpsest in this place in terms of ethnicity. I thought about ethnicity in class, because I played on soccer teams here, and I was telling you guys this afternoon, I played for the Greek team, and our biggest game was against the Macedonians, and you would have thought World War III was going to erupt when we played. So I thought about those things in that way, but I didn't think about racialized landscapes so much. I did think about them in terms of Native Americans, though. So I remember living in a house out on, what was my address? Fellows Avenue, and getting the deed, and realizing that the deed in my house went all the way back to the 1790s state disbursement of the salt lots. And I also knew from my dissertation work that those salt lots were taken from the Onondagas by a treaty, and I knew about the Onondaga treaties, which took communal land and divided it up and gave it to individual natives, so that, in a very Foucauldian way, so that you could then approach individuals and dispossess the land rather than have to deal with a collective. So I wasn't thinking about it as race, but I was thinking about historical geographies and equity and justice in those ways. Will that do? Okay. You look like you know Fells Avenue. Yeah.
Well, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed it, Rich. This is less a question, more of a comment. I was really struck by all the stories, but the third one, when you're talking about the debate that was going on your campus related to this mural, because those debates, well, I guess in some ways they've always been going on, but they're so heated right now. And I definitely have mixed feelings about covering a mural like that. Maybe I'm questioning whether am I liberal or leftist or something like that. Because one of the things I worry about, like if you cover that, then that prevents the opportunity to teach a more critical history of it. Because it's only one step from that saying, like, you shouldn't have put that photo of the mural in your slide because that might make people uncomfortable. It's also not much of a step, too, that, you're talking about white supremacy, things such as that, and throwing slides up that maybe sort of illustrate that you might have a group of 18 white students coming in. It's like, that's really traumatic and makes me uncomfortable to listen to that, and I wish you wouldn't talk about that or have another mural that is questioning of that. Yeah. It seems that this could lead to a road is not really what we expect. So anyway, that's more of a comment than a question.
I actually agree with you. I agree with you completely. But I think that your question is predicated on the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all answer. And I think what geography has taught us, especially since the spatial turn, and we've taken back what was once denigrated as the ideographic and recognized that the global is actually constituted in local places, is that all of these situations are different, right? They are all contingent, and that you must, and that's the historical geography, you must take into account all of these things, and at some point, yes, you must make a political decision. And it may be an uncomfortable one, but it will be a pragmatic decision. So in this particular case, the reason the mural was actually probably it was covered, but it was covered temporarily. It was never intended to be covered permanently. And what would have satisfied everybody would be removing the mural from that iconic building. Right? In the same way in which the Confederate statuary in the Capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, people want to remove that, but the proposals are not to, burn it in a kind of, third world post-colonial way to topple the statues, but to move them to the History Museum, to relegate them funereally to history, and then to give them a discussion in the History Museum, to put them in a different place, in a different context. The problem with the mural was it's a fresco. People wanted to save it, but you can't move it. It would be destroyed. And so in that particular case, the decision was made whether you think about the temporary censorship, if you want to call it that, of the mural, versus the conversation that students of color started on campus in a place which has never been friendly to students of color, and the decision was made to cover it. So it is uncovered in the end. And I think it's about context and contingency and location in this case.
Just at the end, that I'm really heartened by the decision that was made, just the ultimate result of it. But the process was controlled by the which they reached that, I thought was incredible.
Yeah.
The chancellor community students involved, it seems very exemplary.
Yeah. And Rashad, who you saw a picture, Rashad's not a dumb guy, right? He's like, yeah, I see why this might be, I see why you have a different take on the trade on the slaves back. That's really interesting. That's really important. Still doesn't give me a positive moment, right? So there's a conversation. So, yeah.
Thanks, Rich. That was a great talk. In one of your earlier slides, you mentioned that there was a participatory action research component of your project.
Well, I call it that, yeah.
I was just, okay. Well, I was curious to hear more about it, if there is.
So that's just my way of saying, right? So I think of participatory action research as basically something that's working towards a common goal that's shared by a community, and it includes the community of interest. Is that good enough for a shorthand definition of this? And so what's happened is that, you know, I've lived in this little town for 20 years, and it's taken me that long in some ways to be able to get this point and have the trust of my neighbors and have this oral history project. But now when they're doing it, you know, the questions I want to ask, they know me well enough that, you know, I don't know how my grandfather got land. But I'll tell you about when I came out of the Army and I went to Louisville and they wouldn't serve me a hamburger, and I'm thinking, how come I served my country and I can't get a hamburger? And I'm thinking, this is a cool story, right? We'll just go with it. So in that way, it's the stories that people want to tell. And I was really worried in the beginning that they wouldn't want to be recorded, and that they would think this was kind of an academic thing. Can you hear me? Sorry, I walked away from the mic. And then, I guess I am mic'd. And then I said, I'm old. It's technology. And then I said, you know, I'm going to put these in the Louis B. Nunn Center. Is that okay? At the University of Kentucky, where most of the people I'm talking to weren't allowed to attend because they're old enough that it was segregated. And they went, that's great. And so now they're calling me because they want to be on the tape, because they want their stuff to go to UK. So that's why I call it, it's kind of more, if you don't mind, I'll tell you what story. So one of the really eye-opening moments for me came when we were talking to Helen Garner. And she was she was only the third or fourth person I interviewed. And Helen started telling a story about the day in which her father was killed on the front lawn of her house by somebody else in the family. And then she told the story how, this is Black Helen. She turned to White Helen, who's helped me facilitate these things, because she's lived in this town for a long time. And you need to know that White Helen's father was a physician in town, was a horse farm owner, and had the biggest house in town up on the only hill in town. But she's very good friends with these black women of her same age, and they've been working for 20 years to get a nursing home in town, and they've come to some agreement amongst themselves about how they live. I don't know why. And then it turns out Black Helen turns to White Helen, and talking about the day her father shot, she says, well, then your daddy came. And Helen said, I never heard that story. Why my daddy came? Oh, your daddy came to make sure everything was taken care of, and so that the sheriff wouldn't intervene. And I suddenly realized that it's not just white stories and black stories, it's town stories, right? There's a kind of it's town stories that include these, depending on who's there, the mixtures. And that becomes more participatory as well. So my friend Doug Boyd runs the oral history thing. I don't think he's ever listens because, you know, I've violated every rule in the book. You're supposed to have one person and it's supposed to be clear. And I go into somebody's house and I want to interview them. You know, their daughter's going to come, and Aunt so-and-so, and, you know, most of the ones that I've done, I haven't done that many, they have 2 or 3, 4 people on tape. And there was that one of the women in the March in Washington, there were 8 people in my kitchen. And after a while, you have no idea who's talking. You can't do a transcript. But it's really partly about the process, and it's about what they want to talk about. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, it's some men in Maddoxtown, I can't remember the term, like scalding hogs. It's during the annual hog butchery. So one of the stories that I learned, and I dug into it, is that in a lot of these small towns and invisible hamlets, animals were kept like semi-communally. And so you'd have pigs running around, and once a year all the men would get together and butcher the hogs for the community. Yeah, just be glad all you can see is the steam, I guess is what I should say. Yes.
So thank you very much for your talk. So historian, no geographical skills whatsoever, except I have a good sense of direction. But
I found that historians usually lie about those kinds of things.
Yeah, right. So I'm interested in going back to the Midway Road and the disparate landscapes on either side. And so the farm where you found the wall art, graffiti.
I don't know what to call it.
I don't
know what to call it.
You portrayed it at the beginning of your talk as sort of run down, you know, not landscape, not mode, and about the sort of wealth divide in the countryside. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and white decline in Kentucky.
Yeah, I need to be careful because this is not, I mean, I'm just going to be really glib about this. That's not hillbilly Kentucky.
Yeah.
That's, so, I mean, that farm, when I say it's not kept, it is kept up. It's fine for a tobacco and cattle farm, and the guy takes care of it, and it's you know, it's a 200-something acre farm now, which makes it roughly a $4 million piece of property, and he could sell it, and he could sell it tomorrow, right? And it's not, so the land politics isn't a, no, it's just that it's not for horses. And so what you're looking at is the verge, that's the English word, anyway, the space between the road and the fields itself. If you look at his fields, the tobacco fields are immaculate, and the cattle fields, well, they're cattle pastures. I mean, they look like cattle pastures, but the cattle are Black Angus of the highest, you know, highest quality going to market and so on. So that land politics is actually one between kind of, to be simple about it, a kind of long-standing local farmers who basically see the land as an avenue to wealth, who would really, if they're going to retire, want to be able to sell it and put subdivisions on it. And then the horse farmers for whom this is second houses or investment, or not even investment, they can afford to lose money, who don't want to see development, who want to keep it pristine, who are putting conservation easements on it. So the tobacco guys don't like the conservation easements, the other guys do. It depresses the land value, so it's that kind of battle. No, but you're right. We could go 3 counties south, east, west, and we would have that kind of white decline farm stuff, especially since the tobacco buyout, because tobacco was the salvation of the smallholder until the buyout, which was like what, 12 years ago. So we're only 2 years past the end of it, and we'll wait and see what happens to all those smallholders in Trump country.
Well, the good news is we have a reception if you go out the store and you turn right, and you can ask him any other question that you wanted if you didn't have time. Undergrads, I'm looking at all of you. So thank you guys for coming, and let's give Rich a big round of applause for his